November 1942, the skies above Tunisia. Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Marseille, already a legend with over 150 victories, studied the approaching formation through his canopy. Twin-boomed aircraft, ungainly, almost comical in their configuration. "The Americans have sent us flying ducks," he remarked to his wingman. "Those things look like two fighters welded together by someone who failed engineering school. Within 6 months, those flying ducks would decimate the Luftwaffe's transport fleet, destroy hundreds of German aircraft, and earn a reputation that would haunt German pilots for the rest of the war." This is the story of how German commanders learned to fear what they once mocked, how the Lockheed P-38 Lightning transformed from an object of derision into the most versatile killer in the Mediterranean theatre. In February 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued one of the most demanding specifications in aviation history. They wanted an interceptor capable of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. They wanted it to reach that altitude in 6 minutes. They wanted range, firepower, and performance that no existing single-engine fighter could deliver. Most manufacturers looked at the specification and walked away. The requirements were impossible with available technology. But at Lockheed's Burbank facility, a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. At just 27 years old, Johnson was already recognized as a brilliant aerodynamicist. Working under Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard, Johnson proposed something radical. If one engine couldn't meet the specifications, use two. But not in a traditional twin-engine configuration. Johnson's design placed the engines in separate booms extending back from the wing, with the pilot sitting in a central nacelle between them. Twin vertical stabilizers rose from the rear of each boom, connected by a horizontal stabilizer. The propellers counter-rotated to cancel torque effects. All weapons mounted in the nose, allowing concentrated fire without synchronization issues. The design was so unconventional that when the Army first saw the mock-up, several officers questioned whether it would actually fly. It looked more like an engineering experiment than a fighter aircraft. The twin booms gave it an almost insect-like appearance. The central nacelle seemed too small for a combat pilot. The whole thing appeared fragile, delicate, like it might fall apart in the first hard maneuver. But the mathematics were sound. The twin Allison V1710 engines, each producing 1,000 horsepower, gave the aircraft unprecedented power. General Electric turbochargers, mounted in the booms behind the engines, delivered sea-level performance at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. The armament concentrated in the nose created a cone of destruction that could reach out to 1,000 yards, far beyond the convergence range of wing-mounted guns. On January 27, 1939, test pilot Lieutenant Ben Kelsey took the XP-38 prototype up for its maiden flight from March Field in California. The aircraft performed flawlessly. It climbed like nothing Kelsey had ever flown. It was fast, stable, and responsive. 2 weeks later, Kelsey attempted a transcontinental speed record flight to demonstrate the new fighter's capabilities to the Army brass. He flew from California to New York in 7 hours and 2 minutes, shattering the existing record. But as he approached Mitchell Field on Long Island for landing, the engines cut out. Low on fuel and with dead engines, Kelsey put the prototype down on a golf course, destroying the aircraft. He walked away with minor injuries, but the only XP-38 was a total loss. Despite the loss of the prototype, the Army was impressed enough to order 13 evaluation aircraft. The YP-38s that followed incorporated refinements based on test data. The armament changed from the prototype's mix of machine guns and a 37mm cannon to a more practical combination of 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon. All mounted in the nose. No synchronization required. Just pure, concentrated firepower. Production models added armor plate behind the pilot, bulletproof windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks. By late 1941, the first combat-ready P-38Ds were entering service. The aircraft could reach 400 miles per hour, faster than any production fighter in the world. It could climb to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes. Its service ceiling exceeded 38,000 feet, and its range, with external fuel tanks, approached 1,300 miles. But there were problems. Serious problems. During high-speed dives, pilots discovered that as the aircraft approached 500 miles per hour, shock waves would form on the wings. The controls would lock up, the nose would tuck under, steepening the dive. Pilots had no choice but to ride it out, hoping to reach denser air at lower altitude where they might regain control. Several test pilots died trying to solve the compressibility problem. The P-38 was encountering the edge of the sound barrier, aerodynamic phenomena that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Lockheed engineers worked frantically to find solutions, but in late 1941, with war looming, there was no time for extensive redesigns. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. The P-38, problems and all, was going into combat. The first P-38 unit deployed to combat was the 1st Fighter Group, which arrived in England in the summer of 1942. On August 14, 1942, 2nd Lieutenant Elza Shahan, flying a P-38F from Iceland, encountered a Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor maritime patrol bomber over the Atlantic. Shahan's attack run was textbook. He closed to 300 yards and opened fire with all 5 nose-mounted guns. The concentrated firepower from 450 calibers and one 20mm cannon shredded the Condor in seconds. It was the first German aircraft shot down by the United States Army Air Forces. The P-38 had drawn first blood. But that single victory couldn't hide the aircraft's shortcomings. British pilots who test flew the P-38 were unimpressed. It was heavy. It was complex. The cockpit heating was inadequate for operations at high altitude over northern Europe. The engines, reliable in warmer climates, suffered in the cold, damp conditions of England. Most critically, the restricted P-38s that reached Britain lacked turbochargers, robbing them of their high-altitude performance advantage. When Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, was launched in November 1942, the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups were redirected from England to Algeria with their P-38s. The Lightning was about to face the Luftwaffe in earnest for the first time, and German pilots were confident they'd found easy prey. The first encounters seemed to confirm German expectations. On November 28, 1942, Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 53 intercepted a formation of P-38s, escorting bombers near Tunis. The German fighters, piloted by veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, Britain and Russia, executed perfect bounce attacks from above. They shot down 7 Lightnings without loss. The P-38 pilots, most with less than 100 hours in type, were overwhelmed. Over the next 2 months, losses mounted. The 14th Fighter Group was particularly hard hit. Between November 1942 and late January 1943, the group lost 32 pilots out of an original complement of 54. By the end of January, the 14th had only 7 operational aircraft remaining. The group had to be withdrawn from combat to reorganize. German pilots developed a clear picture of the P-38's weaknesses. It couldn't turn with the Bf-109. It couldn't match the roll rate of the Focke-Wulf 190. At medium altitudes where most combat occurred, German fighters held the advantage in maneuverability. The P-38 was big, heavy, and in the hands of inexperienced pilots, an easy kill. Hauptmann Heinz Bahr, a German ace with over 200 victories, encountered P-38s in January 1943 during an interception of B-17 bombers. His report to headquarters was dismissive. The American twin-engine fighter is large and slow to maneuver. Our pilots can position behind it easily. The concentrated nose armament is dangerous if they get a shot, but breaking away is simple. They cannot follow in a hard turn. Several Luftwaffe pilots began specializing in P-38 kills. Franz Schiess of JG-53 would eventually claim 17 Lightnings destroyed, earning him recognition as the leading Lightning killer in the Luftwaffe. But something was happening that German intelligence failed to fully appreciate. While P-38s were being shot down, they were absorbing incredible punishment before falling. Aircraft returned to base with dozens of cannon holes, damage that would have destroyed any German fighter. The Lightning's twin-engine configuration meant that even with one engine shot out, pilots could limp home. The rugged construction and redundant systems kept badly damaged aircraft flying. More importantly, when P-38 pilots did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The concentration of 450 calibers and one 20mm cannon, all firing in a tight pattern, delivered more metal per second than any single-engine fighter. German pilots who survived P-38 attacks described it as flying into a wall of lead. By early 1943, the situation in North Africa was becoming desperate for the Axis. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, driven back by British forces after the defeat at El Alamein, was compressed into Tunisia. Supply by sea was increasingly impossible. British submarines and aircraft operating from Malta were decimating Axis convoys. The Germans had no choice but to rely on air transport to keep their forces supplied. Every day, formations of Junkers, Ju-52 transports, along with the massive six-engine Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant transports, flew from Sicily to Tunisian airfields carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. These transports were escorted by fighters, but the sheer volume of flights meant that some formations flew with minimal protection. Allied intelligence, reading German communications through ultra-intercepts, knew the transport schedules in detail. They knew departure times, routes, and destination airfields. In late March 1943, General Karl Spaatz, commanding the Northwest African Air Forces, ordered a coordinated campaign to destroy the German air bridge. The operation was codenamed Flax. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. P-38 Lightnings, with their long range and heavy armament, would sweep the strait between Sicily and Tunisia, hunting for transport formations. Medium bombers would attack Axis airfields in Sicily and Tunisia, catching transports on the ground. Heavy bombers would strike Italian ports where the transports originated. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe's transport fleet and starve the Afrika Korps into submission. On the morning of April 5, 1943, Operation Flax began in earnest. 26 P-38Fs of the 82nd Fighter Group took off from their base in Algeria and headed northeast toward Cape Bon, the northeastern tip of Tunisia. They climbed to 18,000 feet, using the altitude advantage that the Lightning's turbochargers provided. At 8 a.m., about 5 miles north of Cape Bon, they spotted what every fighter pilot dreams of: a massive formation of Axis aircraft, flying low over the water. The Americans counted between 50 and 70 Junkers, Ju-52 transports in tight formation. Escorting them were approximately 20 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, 4 Focke-Wulf 190s, 6 Junkers, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, and 1 Focke-Wulf 189 reconnaissance aircraft. Below the aerial armada, a dozen merchant vessels ploughed through the Mediterranean, carrying supplies to Tunisia. The P-38 formation leader, Major William Leverett, quickly assessed the situation. The German fighters were positioned above and slightly ahead of the transports, the standard escort formation, but they weren't high enough. The P-38s held the altitude advantage. Leverett ordered the attack. The Lightnings rolled over and dove. Two things became immediately apparent in that dive. First, nothing could keep up with a diving P-38. The aircraft's weight, initially seen as a disadvantage, became a weapon. In the dive, the Lightnings accelerated past 450 miles per hour. The German fighters, lighter and more maneuverable in level flight, simply couldn't match that dive speed. By the time the escort realized they were under attack, the P-38s were already among the transports. Second, the nose-mounted armament of the Lightning proved devastatingly effective against large, slow targets. The Ju-52 was a tri-motor transport with a fabric-covered fuselage. Tough enough for airline service, no match for concentrated 50 caliber fire. The first P-38 through the formation opened fire at 400 yards. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon converged on a single Ju-52. The transport's right engine exploded. The wing folded. The Ju-52 rolled, inverted, and went into the sea. 8 seconds from first shot to impact. The formation of transports tried to scatter, but they were too slow, too unwieldy. The P-38s had speed and position. They made firing pass after firing pass. Some Ju-52s tried to drop to wave-top altitude, hoping that the P-38s wouldn't risk flying that low. But the American pilots pressed their attacks down to 50 feet above the water. The concentrated fire was merciless. When a P-38's guns converged on a Ju-52, the transport didn't just go down, it came apart. Wings separated from fuselages, tails were severed, engines were blown clean off their mounts. The German fighter escort tried desperately to intervene, but they faced an impossible tactical situation. If they dove after the P-38s attacking the transports, the Lightnings could easily dive away, then zoom climb back to altitude. If they stayed high to maintain the energy advantage, They couldn't protect the transports. The few German fighters that did engage found themselves facing the same nose armament that was shredding the transports. A Bf-109 that got in front of a P-38 was hit by a stream of fire that no single engine fighter could withstand. When the action ended 15 minutes later, the Americans claimed 31 enemy aircraft destroyed, 11 Ju-52 transports, 2 Bf-109 fighters, and 2 Ju-87 dive bombers confirmed. The actual German losses were likely higher. Aircraft that made it back to Sicily crash-landed with fatal damage. 2 P-38s were lost, 1 to fighter attack, 1 to unknown causes. But the significance of April 5th went beyond the kill ratio. The P-38 pilots had discovered tactics that exploited the Lightning's true strengths. Altitude and speed. Dive and zoom. Hit hard and get out fast. Don't turn with German fighters. Don't climb with them at medium altitude. Use weight and power to control engagement geometry. Over the next 2 weeks, P-38s continued to hunt German transports over the Mediterranean. On April 10th, another sweep caught a formation of Ju-52s at low altitude. 26 more transports were claimed destroyed. On April 11th, P-38s intercepted a formation flying from Marsala, Sicily to Cape Bon. Another 26 transports and 5 escort fighters went into the water. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet was being massacred. Then came April 18th, 1943. Palm Sunday. Late in the afternoon, 4 squadrons of P-40 Warhawks from the 57th Fighter Group, with top cover provided by RAF Spitfires, were returning from a patrol over Tunisia. Flying at 4,000 feet, they spotted something extraordinary. A massive formation of Junkers Ju-52 transports, approximately 90 aircraft, flying in 3 large V formations at wavetop altitude. The Germans were trying to avoid radar detection by flying as low as possible. But the late afternoon sun, low on the horizon, illuminated the formation perfectly against the dark water. The P-40 leader didn't hesitate. His squadrons dropped down and attacked. What followed was one of the most one-sided air battles of the war. The Ju-52s, loaded with troops and supplies, were helpless. They tried to maintain formation. Some passengers fired rifles and machine guns out the windows in desperation. It made no difference. The P-40s and Spitfires tore through the formation like sharks through a school of fish. Ju-52s fell into the Mediterranean in such numbers that the sea was littered with wreckage for miles. The escorting German fighters, outnumbered and out of position, could do little. When the battle ended, the Allies claimed 146 victories. The actual confirmed count was 59 aircraft destroyed, 24 Ju-52 transports shot down, 10 German fighters. Another 35 Ju-52s managed to crash land on the Sicilian coast, damaged beyond repair, for the loss of 6 P-40s and 1 Spitfire. The Palm Sunday massacre, as it became known, effectively ended the German air bridge to Tunisia. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, initially ordered all transport flights to cease. Albert Kesselring, the theatre commander, protested. The Afrika Korps would collapse without air supply. Göring relented, but transport flights were now restricted to night operations only, and at a much smaller scale. The damage was done. Without adequate supplies, Rommel's forces could not hold. By early May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered. Over 250,000 Axis troops went into captivity. It was a defeat on the scale of Stalingrad, and the P-38 Lightning had played a crucial role. During April 1943 alone, P-38s claimed over 100 Axis transport aircraft destroyed. The actual number was lower, perhaps 60 to 70 confirmed, but even that represented an irreplaceable loss for the Luftwaffe. The transport fleet never recovered. For the rest of the war, German forces in isolated positions would suffer from inadequate air supply. But what about the nickname? The Fork-tailed Devil. German pilots supposedly called it a Gabelschwanz Teufel. The story goes that a captured German pilot, hysterical after being shot down by a P-38, kept repeating the phrase to his captors. The nickname appears in a Life magazine article from August 1943, describing the P-38's success in North Africa. The article presented it as confirmation that German pilots feared the Lightning. But research into German documents and post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans tells a different story. No German military documents use the term. No Luftwaffe combat reports mention it. When asked after the war, German fighter pilots said they never heard the nickname used. Some suggested that if anyone called the P-38 that, it would have been ground troops who were attacked by lightnings in the fighter-bomber role. The nickname was likely created by American journalists or public relations officers, perhaps based on a single comment from one German POW, then amplified for propaganda purposes. The reality was more complex than the nickname suggested. German fighter pilots respected the P-38, but they didn't fear it the way they feared the later P-51 Mustang. In fact, post-war surveys of German POWs asked which Allied fighter they least wanted to encounter. The Spitfire topped the list. The P-38 was consistently chosen as the fighter they most preferred to engage. Why? Because in the tactical environment of air-to-air combat, especially at medium altitudes, the P-38 had exploitable weaknesses. It couldn't turn with single-engine fighters. Its roll rate was inferior. In the hands of inexperienced pilots, which described most American P-38 pilots in 1943, it was vulnerable to bounce attacks from above. Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jägerschwere 77 in North Africa, gave a balanced assessment. The P-38 is faster than our Bf-109Fs, especially at altitude. Its armament is devastating when it hits, but it turns like a truck. In a dogfight at low to medium altitude, we have the advantage if we can force them to turn. The P-38 must use its speed and altitude to be effective. If we can bring them down to our level, they become targets. But there was one role where the P-38 was absolutely dominant: destroying bombers and transports. The concentrated nose armament could saw a bomber in half in seconds. The long range meant P-38s could escort their own bombers deep into enemy territory or hunt for targets far from base. And the high-altitude performance, courtesy of those turbochargers, meant the Lightning could climb above most interceptors. In June 1943, P-38s began escorting heavy bombers in raids on targets in Italy. On June 10, 1944, a year later, P-38s mounted one of the war's most audacious missions. 36 Lightnings, each carrying a 1,000-pound bomb, raided the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, escorted by 39 more P-38s flying top cover. The target was heavily defended. Ploiești was second only to Berlin in the density of anti-aircraft guns. The mission was a disaster. 23 P-38s were shot down, most by flak. But the survivors delivered their bombs on target, and the escorting fighters shot down multiple German interceptors. The P-38 had proven it could strike deep into the heart of Axis territory. By late 1943, the P-38's reputation in the Mediterranean was established. Not as the invincible fork-tailed devil of propaganda, but as a versatile, deadly weapon system that German commanders had learned to respect. In the fighter role against other fighters, it was effective when flown by experienced pilots who understood its strengths and limitations. In the ground attack role, it was devastating. The 450 caliber machine guns could tear apart trucks, trains, and light armor. In the bomber-destroyer role, it was unmatched. That concentration of nose-mounted firepower could bring down the heaviest aircraft. And in the reconnaissance role, camera-equipped F-4 and F-5 variants proved invaluable. The P-38's speed and altitude performance made it nearly impossible for German fighters to intercept reconnaissance Lightnings. The aircraft's specifications tell part of the story. The P-38J, the most common variant in the Mediterranean by mid-1944, had two Allison V1710 engines producing 1,425 horsepower each. Top speed was 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling was 44,000 feet. Range with drop tanks exceeded 300 miles. Armament was one 20mm cannon with 150 rounds and 450 caliber machine guns with 500 rounds each. The aircraft could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets. Empty weight was 12,800 pounds. Loaded weight approached 18,000 pounds. That weight was both weakness and strength. Weakness in turning fights, strength in dives and zoom climbs. By early 1944, the P-38 groups in the Mediterranean had developed tactics that maximized strengths and minimized weaknesses. They flew high, typically 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where the turbochargers gave them a performance advantage. When German fighters appeared below, the P-38s would dive, building speed to over 450 miles per hour. At that speed, deflection shooting was nearly impossible for defending fighters, The P-38s would make one high-speed pass, firing as they went through the formation, then zoom climb back to altitude using their speed and power. If German fighters tried to follow, the Lightnings would extend away, then come back for another pass. The 1st Fighter Group, one of the original P-38 units in the theatre, refined these tactics to an art form. By the end of the war, the group had 2 presidential unit citations, the only fighter group to earn 2 in less than a week. The citations were for actions supporting the invasion of southern France and subsequent operations in northern Italy. In both cases, P-38s provided air cover that prevented the Luftwaffe from interfering with ground operations. The 14th Fighter Group, after its disastrous start in late 1942, came back strong. Reorganized with new aircraft and new pilots in the spring of 1943, the group went on to produce several aces. Lieutenant William Sloan, flying with the 82nd Fighter Group, became one of the leading P-38 aces in the Mediterranean, with 12 confirmed victories. His tally included 6 Bf-109s, 2 Macchi C-200s, 1 Macchi C-202, 1 Reggiane Re 2001, 1 Ju-88, and 1 Du-217. Sloan's success came from understanding the P-38's capabilities. He never tried to dogfight. He used altitude and speed. He picked his targets carefully. And he never forgot that the concentrated nose armament meant he only needed one good shot. Lieutenant Michael Breezes, flying with the 14th Fighter Group, also scored 12 victories, 2 Me-210s, 4 Bf-109s, and 6 FW-190s. Breezes described the P-38's firepower in an interview years later. When you hit them with all 5 guns, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw a 109 literally disintegrate. 1 second it was there, the next it was just debris and smoke. That's what 50 calibers and a 20mm cannon do to an aircraft at close range. But for every success story there were losses. P-38 pilots who forgot the aircraft's limitations and tried to turn with German fighters often paid with their lives. On August 30th, 1943, 13 P-38s were shot down in a single day during bomber escort missions over Italy. On September 2nd, 1940, 10 P-38s were lost in combat with just 4 Bf-109s from JG-50. Franz Schiess, the Lightning Killer, got 3 of them himself. The P-38 was never a forgiving aircraft. It required skill, experience, and discipline to fly effectively in combat. The aircraft's greatest limitation was its complexity. The turbochargers required careful management. The intercoolers needed monitoring. The fuel system, with multiple tanks in the wings and fuselage, demanded constant attention to maintain proper balance. In the cold, high-altitude environment of Northern Europe, the P-38 suffered terribly. Cockpit heating was inadequate, engines froze, pilots developed frostbite. But in the Mediterranean, with its warmer climate and lower typical combat altitudes, these problems were less severe. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the P-38 had established a record in the Mediterranean that, while not matching its legendary status in the Pacific, was nonetheless impressive. 3 P-38 groups, the 1st, 14th and 82nd, served in the theatre from Operation Torch through the end of the war. They flew thousands of sorties, claimed hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed, and provided crucial support for ground operations from North Africa through Sicily, Italy and southern France. The transformation from November 1942 to May 1945 was remarkable. In the early days, German pilots laughed at the ungainly twin-boomed fighter and racked up easy victories against inexperienced American pilots. By the end, German commanders in the Mediterranean theatre knew that when P-38s appeared overhead, their transports were doomed, their fighters would be engaged on unfavourable terms, and their ground forces would face devastating attack. The P-38 never earned universal fear from German pilots the way some Allied propaganda claimed, but it earned respect. Johannes Steinhoff, the JG-77 commander who fought P-38s in North Africa, summed it up in a post-war interview. At first we thought the P-38 was a mistake. Too big, too complex, too heavy. We were wrong. It wasn't a mistake. It was just a different approach to fighter design. The Americans built a fighter that used power and firepower instead of maneuverability. When they learned to fly it properly, it became very dangerous. Not in the classic dogfight, but in hit-and-run attacks, in destroying bombers and transports, in ground attack. The P-38 was a weapon that worked if used correctly. The key phrase is if used correctly. The P-38 required a specific tactical approach. It required discipline from pilots not to get drawn into turning fights. It required commanders who understood how to employ the aircraft's strengths. In the Mediterranean, after painful early lessons, the USAF learned those lessons. The result was an aircraft that, while not dominant in every role, was lethally effective in the roles it was designed for. The statistics tell part of the story. In the Mediterranean theatre, P-38s claimed over 600 enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat. They destroyed thousands of vehicles, hundreds of locomotives, and countless other ground targets. They flew reconnaissance missions that provided invaluable intelligence. They escorted bombers deep into enemy territory. They supported amphibious invasions, but statistics don't capture the human element. The pilots who climbed into those twin-boomed fighters, knowing they were flying a complex, unforgiving aircraft into combat against experienced enemies. The ground crews who kept the Lightnings flying under primitive conditions, often working through the night to repair battle damage. The commanders who learned through trial and error how to employ the P-38 effectively. November 1942. German pilots laugh at the ungainly American fighter. May 1945. German pilots no longer laugh. They've learned that those twin booms mean twice the power. That distinctive silhouette means concentrated firepower. That complex aircraft means versatile lethality. The P-38 Lightning didn't conquer the Mediterranean skies through dominance in classic dogfights. It conquered them through versatility, firepower, and the determination of the men who flew it. German commanders thought it was clumsy, until it ruled the Mediterranean. The transformation of German opinion wasn't just about tactics and kills. It was about the cumulative effect of facing an opponent that simply wouldn't quit. That couldn't be intimidated. That kept coming back, mission after mission, day after day, until the Luftwaffe's position in the Mediterranean became untenable. By December 1943, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula was grinding forward against determined German resistance. Every mile gained cost blood and time. The Germans held the high ground, used the terrain masterfully, and made the Allies pay for every river crossing, every mountain pass, every village. But they couldn't move during daylight, because the P-38s owned the sky. The fighter-bomber missions became the Lightning's signature role in Italy. Each P-38 could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, or a single 2,000-pounder under the centerline. With the nose armament still available, the Lightning could deliver its ordnance and then strafe targets of opportunity on the way out. German commanders quickly learned that concentrating forces for counterattacks during daylight hours meant inviting destruction from above. Oberst Ludwig Heilmann, commanding the 4th Fallschirmjäger Division, during the fighting around Monte Cassino, experienced P-38 attacks repeatedly throughout early 1944. His division was elite, composed of veteran paratroopers who had fought from Crete to the Eastern Front. They weren't easily rattled, but the constant air attacks wore them down. Heilmann wrote in his combat diary, "The American twin-engine fighters appear every day, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in formations of a dozen or more. They come in low, drop their bombs with remarkable accuracy, then strafe anything that moves. My men have learned to dig deep and stay hidden during daylight. We can only move supplies and reposition forces at night. This is not warfare. This is endurance." The P-38's ground attack effectiveness came from several factors. First, the pilot sat high in the central nacelle with excellent visibility. Unlike single-engine fighters where the long nose blocked forward view during approach, P-38 pilots could see their targets clearly throughout the attack run. Second, the twin engines provided redundancy. Flak that would down a single-engine fighter might destroy one P-38 engine, but the aircraft could make it home on one. Third, the nose-mounted guns meant no convergence issues. The pilot aimed the aircraft at the target and fired. Where the nose pointed, the bullets went. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins, commanding the 71st Fighter Squadron of the 1st Fighter Group, developed tactics specifically for ground attack missions over Italy. His approach was systematic and ruthless. P-38s would approach the target area at 8,000 to 10,000 feet, high enough to be safe from light anti-aircraft fire. They'd identify targets, then split into attack sections. The first section would dive at a steep angle, reaching speeds over 400 miles per hour, and release bombs from 2,000 to 3,000 feet. As they pulled off target, the second section would already be diving. After bombs were expended, the sections would regroup and make strafing passes, coming in low and fast, hitting secondary targets. German troops learned that the sound of P-38s meant finding cover immediately, the distinctive rumble of the Allison engines slightly out of sync with each. Other was recognizable from miles away. Luftwaffe pilots called it the symphony, though there was nothing musical about what followed. American troops advancing through Italy reported finding German positions abandoned not because of ground combat, but because the occupants had been destroyed from the air. Trenches filled with bodies, vehicles burning, ammunition dumps exploding. The P-38s were doing to German ground forces what the Luftwaffe had done to Polish and French forces in 1939 and 1940. The cycle had turned. But the P-38 wasn't invincible. German flak crews became increasingly effective as the war progressed. The Flak 38, a 20mm automatic cannon, was specifically effective against low-flying aircraft. In dense concentrations, 20mm flak could throw up a wall of explosive shells that even the rugged P-38 couldn't penetrate unscathed. On January 22, 1944, during the Anzio landings, P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group were providing close air support when they encountered heavy flak over German positions. 5 Lightnings were shot down in a single mission. The pilots who survived described flying through explosions so dense that avoiding all of them was impossible. You just flew through it and hoped. The heavier 88mm flak guns were less numerous, but far more deadly. A single 88mm shell didn't need a direct hit. A near miss could tear a wing off or sever control cables. During missions over heavily defended targets like rail yards and port facilities, P-38 formations would face barrages of 88mm fire that filled the sky with black bursts. Flight leaders learned to vary altitude constantly, jinking and weaving to throw off the predictors that calculated firing solutions. But some shells always found their mark. The 14th Fighter Group lost 14 P-38s to flak in March 1944 alone during interdiction missions against German supply lines. Then there was the human factor. Not all P-38 pilots were aces. Not all had the skill to exploit the aircraft's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Second Lieutenant James Watkins joined the 1st Fighter Group in February 1944 as a replacement pilot. He had 150 hours in the P-38, which seemed like a lot until he flew his first combat mission. Watkins survived the war and wrote about his experiences decades later. My first combat mission was supposed to be a milk run, bomber escort to a target in northern Italy. We climbed to 28,000 feet. Everything was fine until we got bounced by Bf-109s out of the sun. I never saw them coming. My element leader called brake right. I pulled as hard as I could. The P-38 shuddered. The controls got mushy. I was on the edge of a stall at 28,000 feet with German fighters all around. Someone screamed on the radio that he was hit. I rolled left, trying to see what was happening. A 109 flashed past my nose so close I could see the pilot's face. I fired, missed by a mile. Then they were gone. The whole thing lasted maybe 90 seconds. I was shaking so hard I could barely fly home. That's when I understood the P-38 wasn't going to save me. I had to learn to save myself. Watkins survived because he learned. He learned to keep his head on a swivel, constantly scanning for threats. He learned to maintain speed because a slow P-38 was a dead P-38. He learned to trust his wingman and be worthy of his wingman's trust. He learned that the nose guns were only effective if he could get them on target, which meant predicting where the enemy would be, not where they were. By the end of the war, Watkins had 3 confirmed victories and 7 probable. He flew 87 combat missions. He brought his P-38 home every time, twice on one engine. That was the reality for most P-38 pilots. Not dramatic ace-making victories, but grinding missions day after day. Escort duty where nothing happened. Reconnaissance flights dodging flak. Ground attack missions where the target's shot back. The work that doesn't make headlines but wins wars. The P-38 also served in roles that had nothing to do with combat. The F-5 reconnaissance variant, stripped of guns and loaded with cameras, flew some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Photo reconnaissance required flying alone, deep into enemy territory, over heavily defended targets, at predictable altitudes to get clear photographs. The F-5 pilots relied entirely on speed and altitude to survive. Major Karl Polifka, flying F-5s with the 3rd Photo Reconnaissance Group, completed 25 reconnaissance missions over Italy and southern France. He described the experience as uniquely terrifying. In a fighter, you have guns. You can shoot back. In an F-5 you have cameras and speed. That's it. You fly the mission alone. No wingman, no support. Just you and the sky full of people trying to kill you. You photograph the target maintaining straight and level flight while flak bursts around you, then you run. You push the throttles to the stops and you run. The P-38's speed saved my life a dozen times. German fighters would try to intercept, but by the time they climbed to my altitude, I was already gone, heading home at 400 miles per hour. The intelligence gathered by F-5 missions was invaluable. Photographs revealed German troop concentrations, supply dumps, defensive positions, and airfield layouts. Bomber crews relied on reconnaissance photos to plan missions. Ground commanders used them to identify weak points in German lines. The F-5s flying from Italian bases photographed targets throughout occupied Europe, from France to the Balkans, and they did it in an unarmed aircraft that relied entirely on the P-38's performance to survive. By the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of southern France codenamed Operation Dragoon, P-38s were flying multiple roles simultaneously. Fighter sweeps to clear the skies of German interceptors, bomber escort to protect B-25s and B-26s attacking coastal defences, ground, attack missions destroying radar stations and flak positions, reconnaissance flights mapping German dispositions. The versatility that Kelly Johnson had designed into the aircraft was being fully exploited. On August 15, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of southern France between Toulon and Cannes. The invasion, smaller than Normandy but still involving over 150,000 troops, benefited from overwhelming air superiority. P-38s from the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups flew continuous patrols over the landing beaches. German fighters barely appeared. The Luftwaffe in southern France had been reduced to fewer than 100 operational aircraft, and most of those were held back, unwilling to face the Allied fighter screen. When German fighters did attempt to attack the invasion fleet, they were massacred. On the afternoon of August 15th, 6 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 200 attempted to strafe Allied ships off the coast. They were intercepted by 8 P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group. All 6 German fighters were shot down in less than 5 minutes. No P-38s were lost. The German pilot who survived, Unteroffizier Klaus Neumann, was fished out of the Mediterranean by Allied patrol boats. His interrogation report is preserved in US archives. Neumann described the engagement with the bitterness of a man who knew he'd been sent on a suicide mission. We were ordered to attack the ships, 6 fighters against the entire Allied Air Force. We knew it was hopeless, but orders are orders. We went in low, trying to stay under their radar. We got close to the ships when the twin-engine fighters came down on us. They were so fast. We never had a chance to even line up on a target. Schneider was hit first, his aircraft exploded, then Weber, then Hoffmann. I tried to break away, but they followed me down to wave-top level. My engine was hit. I had to ditch. I was in the water watching my friend's aircraft burning around me. This is what the war has become, sending boys in obsolete fighters to die for nothing. Neumann's comment about obsolete fighters was telling. By late 1944, the Bf-109G, the most common German fighter in the Mediterranean, was at a severe disadvantage against Allied fighters. The early Bf-109 variants that had dominated in 1940 and 1941 had been formidable machines, but by 1944 they were outclassed. The P-38J could outrun them, outclimb them at high altitude, and certainly outgun them. The only advantage the Bf-109 retained was maneuverability at medium altitudes, but that advantage was meaningless if German pilots couldn't get into position to exploit it. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's best piston engine fighter, was scarce in the Mediterranean. Most FW-190s were concentrated in Germany for homeland defence or on the Eastern Front. The few FW-190 units in Italy were constantly shifted from crisis to crisis, never present in sufficient numbers to make a difference. When FW-190s did encounter P-38s, the results varied. In the hands of experienced pilots, the FW-190 was a deadly opponent. In the hands of the increasingly inexperienced pilots filling German squadrons by late 1944, it was just another target. The quality gap between Allied and German pilots had widened dramatically by 1944. American replacement pilots arrived in theatre with 200 to 300 hours of flight time, including 50 to 100 hours in type. German replacement pilots by late 1944 were arriving at frontline units with as little as 50 hours total time, sometimes with no hours in the aircraft they'd be flying in combat. The German training system, which had produced superb pilots in the early war years, had collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages, instructor losses, and the grinding attrition of multi-front warfare. First Lieutenant Robert Vrillakas, a P-38 pilot with the 14th Fighter Group, described an encounter in September 1944 that illustrated the skill gap. "We intercepted a flight of 4 109s over Verona. They were flying a tight formation, too tight for combat. We bounced them from above. I got on the tail of the number 4 man. He never took evasive action, just flew straight and level while I closed to 200 yards and opened fire. I hit him with maybe a 2-second burst. His aircraft came apart. I pulled up and saw my wingman had gotten another one. The other 2 scattered and dove for the deck. We chased them, but they got away in the ground clutter. After we landed, I kept thinking about that pilot I shot down. He never moved, never broke, never tried to evade. Either his training was that bad, or he froze, or he never saw me. Any of those options means he should never have been in that cockpit." This wasn't meant as arrogance. Vrillakas understood that brave men were dying because their own high command was sending them into combat unprepared. But that didn't change the tactical reality. By late 1944, encounters between P-38s and German fighters in the Mediterranean were increasingly one-sided. The Germans were losing their best pilots to attrition, while the Americans were gaining experienced combat veterans. The P-38 groups were becoming more effective even as the Luftwaffe was becoming less so. The infrastructure of German air power in Italy was crumbling. Allied bombing had destroyed most major airfields. The survivors were cratered regularly by medium bombers. Fuel was increasingly scarce. The Germans were burning synthetic fuel that fouled engines and reduced performance. Spare parts were unavailable. Aircraft sat grounded, waiting for replacement engines or propellers that never arrived. Major Gunther Specht, serving with Jagdgeschwader 53 in northern Italy in early 1945, kept a diary that was captured after the war. His entries from January and February 1945 reveal the desperation of the Luftwaffe's situation. January 12, 1945. No fuel for operations. Aircraft sit on the field while the Americans fly overhead with impunity. January 20, 1945. Received 30,000 litres of fuel, enough for perhaps 20 sorties. This must last a week. January 28, 1945. Lost Schmidt and Bauer to engine failures. The synthetic fuel is destroying our engines faster than enemy action. February 3, 1945. American twin-engine fighters attack the airfield. 4 of our aircraft destroyed on the ground. We had no fuel to fly them anyway. February 9, 1945. Orders to relocate north. No transport available. We will destroy remaining aircraft and march. This is the end. By March 1945, organised Luftwaffe resistance in Italy had ceased. Individual German fighters occasionally appeared, usually flown by desperate pilots trying to protect retreating ground forces. But the systematic defence of Italian airspace was over. The P-38 groups shifted almost entirely to ground attack, supporting the Allied spring offensive that would finally break German resistance in Italy. The final major engagement involving P-38s in the Mediterranean occurred on April 20, 1945. Elements of the 1st Fighter Group were providing close air support for advancing American troops near Bologna when they encountered a formation of German aircraft attempting to evacuate personnel from an airfield ahead of the Allied advance. The German formation consisted of 4 Ju-52 transports, escorted by 6 Bf-109s. The P-38s dove on them from 15,000 feet. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. All 4 Ju-52s were destroyed. 3 Bf-109s were shot down. The remaining 3 German fighters escaped into clouds. It was fitting, in a way, that the P-38's last significant action in the Mediterranean was attacking transports, the role where the Lightning had first proven its worth during Operation Flax 2 years earlier. 9 days later, German forces in Italy surrendered. The war in Europe would end on May 8, 1945. The P-38's combat record in the Mediterranean theatre was extraordinary by any measure. Over 600 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, thousands of ground vehicles destroyed, hundreds of locomotives wrecked, countless tons of bombs delivered on target, thousands of reconnaissance photographs that guided Allied operations, bomber escort missions that brought heavy and medium bombers to their targets and back, close air support missions that broke up German counterattacks and supported Allied advances, but the raw numbers don't capture the full story. The P-38's real impact was in fundamentally changing the tactical and operational environment in the Mediterranean. From the summer of 1943 onward, German forces could not move in daylight without risk of air attack. They could not concentrate forces for counterattacks without being spotted and struck. They could not supply their frontline units efficiently because Allied fighters dominated the skies and roads. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the North African campaign with confidence and experienced pilots, ended the Mediterranean War as a broken force, its transports destroyed, its fighters overwhelmed, its pilots killed or captured. The P-38 Lightning wasn't solely responsible for this transformation. P-40s, Spitfires, P-47s, and later P-51s all contributed. But the Lightning, with its long range, heavy firepower, and high-altitude performance, was the weapon that shattered German air power in the theatre during the critical period of 1943 and 1944. German commanders who had dismissed the P-38 as clumsy in late 1942 had learned by 1945 that clumsiness in a turning fight meant nothing when that aircraft could dive away at will, climb to altitudes where German fighters couldn't follow, and deliver concentrated firepower that destroyed anything it hit. The P-38 Lightning never achieved the legendary status in the Mediterranean that it did in the Pacific, where pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire became America's top aces flying the type. It never became as famous as the P-51 Mustang, which captured the public imagination with its sleek lines and range to Berlin. But for the men who flew it in the Mediterranean, and for the German commanders who faced it, the P-38 was the weapon that turned the tide. Kelly Johnson's twin-boom design, initially ridiculed as ungainly and overcomplex, proved to be exactly what was needed. Power over maneuverability, firepower over elegance, versatility over specialization. The P-38 Lightning ruled the Mediterranean not through dominance in any single role, but through competence in every role. Fighter, fighter-bomber, reconnaissance platform, bomber escort, ground attack aircraft. It did everything, and it did everything well enough to win. That was the ultimate vindication of Johnson's radical design, and the ultimate nightmare for German commanders who learned too late that the clumsy American fighter was actually a revolution in aerial warfare.